Okay, here's my webinar on the deadlift, on why to deadlift, how to deadlift, and how not to deadlift. My name is Graham Lehman. Here's my website, and let's jump into it. So we have to first ask ourselves, why do we want to deadlift? We always look at the risk versus reward. The deadlift is commonly known as a fairly risky exercise. The rewards, let's cover that. Increased size and strength, that's going to help any athlete get better at their sport. It's a great thing to have. The risks, we can help minimize if we're being smart. And the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, why are we deadlifting? If we're going to be smart about why we're deadlifting, are we trying to deadlift so that we can get better at our weight room performance, or are we deadlifting to have better on-field performance? And answering this question as an athlete, you probably should be answering on-field performance. So if that is the case, then we're not going to be stupid and trying to make too fast of gains in the weight room and not paying attention to our perfect technique so that we can stay on the field here, and we're only using the deadlift here to get better over here on the field. Alright, so the reason why we want to deadlift, I mean, what muscles does it work? It's pretty much one of the greatest exercises of all time. Coach Dan John, he's a famous strength conditioning coach. When asked what muscles does that work, he's been known to say this line here. You know that muscle that allows you to jump over the defender and catch the game when you touch down? That one. That's all these muscles back here. You can look at it, the whole back side of your body, aka their posterior chain. Most of your glutes around here, our upper back. Bodybuilders have been known to throw it into their lower bodybuilding days as well as their back training days. It also recruits a ton of forearm strength, and because it's recruiting all those muscles under heavy loads, that's what can give us the size and strength, all the way from big strong glutes, which are going to help us rotate better, run better, throw better, hit better, all these things, all the way up to upper traps and back to help have stronger back muscles, which is going to help us avoid throwing injuries and just getting stronger overall. So let's talk about the setup here first of all. This is obviously an anatomical picture of what it's going to be. The first thing you're going to do, you're going to want to sit your hips back. So you can imagine when this guy first started, his hips would have been in the middle of the line here, and then he sits his hips back. With the cue we want to use is try to touch your butt to the wall. We also want to keep our butt high on the wall. Sometimes people will turn it into a squat and their hips will be lower. So sit your hips back and keep them high. The next thing we're always going to be looking for is a curve in the low back. If you're wearing a shirt here, you'd be able to sort of, once you have that nice low back curve, you're going to see some wrinkles in the shirt, which is what I kind of emphasize there. When you do that, you also end up sort of puffing up your chest. But always, again, making sure that we're always in a straight line, which is where the next one comes in, is where our head is. If we had a stick along this guy's head, shoulders, and tailbone, that stick would run perfectly straight along that. A lot of times people will look up, we'll talk about that later, but we want to cue kind of having what we call a double chin, and that would keep our body in that nice straight line. From there, we always got to have our shoulder blades directly over the bar. The shoulder blades are what holds onto our arms. Our arms are what are going to be lifting the weight up. So when we lift a weight up, we're going to turn our body into a human crane, and we got to have our shoulder blades directly over top of that weight. We'll talk about tall lifters versus short lifters and how they're going to have to sort of change that up, but that is a must. In order to get that, we need vertical shins, our shin bones here. We'll often use a cue of barbed wire. So pretend like there's some barbed wire maybe an inch in front of your shins, and you don't want to scrape your shins along that barbed wire, so that is cueing you to stay up here. So this is really what makes the deadlift a deadlift, where we have this straight shin and then our hips sit back this way. A squat would have a shin that kind of runs at an angle this way, and we would have a lot more knee bend. The bar is above our shoelaces. We can't let it drift in front of us like that. These two kind of fall in together. When we start to get ready for the deadlift, we shift our weight back, and we want to be able to wiggle our toes. So shifting our weight back onto our toes, or off of our toes onto our heels, is going to make sure that we're recruiting all these muscles here. So sometimes you'll see a lot of people go barefoot or wear very flat shoes so that they can push their heels back. You can imagine if you have a running shoe, it's going to be shifting your weight forward and onto your toes. That's the opposite of what we want to have happen. And finally, we want to build up some tension throughout the whole body before pulling the bar actually off the ground. So what we cue is here is kind of taking out the slack or getting tight. What I often do is tell people to lift just the bar. If you can imagine the bar inside of the weights, you can lift a 45-pound bar just itself up against the bottom or the top of the weights, and that just kind of gets you set in that position, and then that's where you need to start to pull from. So we need to take the slack out. So we get tight, we wiggle our toes. So that's a lot of things to remember. So when you're coaching them, or even when you're performing them, try to think of these three things. Number one being wiggle your toes. Number two being put wrinkles in your shirt, or show me the logo on your chest. If you had a T-shirt with a logo on its chest, the coach or your training partner standing in front of you should be able to kind of see that logo, so you're not completely hunched right over. Even if the flat back, like you still need to be able to show that logo. And finally, take out the slack, or get tight is another one. Again, we need to have all that slack out before we try to deadlift, and we'll see why we don't want to do that coming up here. But anyway, those are the three things you want to try to think about. If you try to think about too much more than that, it's going to get difficult to perform the deadlift. Less is better in this case here. So just make sure you're set up right. Cue those three things, and you should be good. So moving on to the grip. This is the one where, as a baseball athlete, this is one where I pretty much insist most of the time we're always going to use what we call a double overhand grip. This way we can't hold it can't hold as much weight as when we do this other way, what's called an alternate grip, or hockey style grip, where you have one foot, one arm, one palm facing back, one palm facing forward. I don't really like it just because of the amount of stress that it puts on the bicep tendon on the arm that's forward. So if you facing forward, so if you do it with your non-throwing arm predominantly. But for the most part, I really like to do this grip. We can still hold a ton of weight, and it's almost like a bit of a safeguard, where if you can't lift enough weight holding onto it this way, then you probably shouldn't be playing around with that weight. Here's a worst case scenario. What happens when you do that type of grip? This guy is about to deadlift, obviously a lot of weight. You watch his bicep tendon right here. His arm just starts to curl up and pop up. We'll watch it one more time just to try to scare you away from doing those type of grip deadlifts again. Because again, remember, we have to remember why we were deadlifting in the first place. We want to become better athletes. So here is the deadlift itself. One thing, right when you start to lift the weight now, once you're set up, once you've done those three things, you need to think about pushing your feet into the ground to lift the weight. Your back must stay strong and stay still. So here, this athlete is getting strong like that. He's pushing his feet into the ground so that the weight can lift, but his shoulders are pulling back and up as he's going up. So as the bar passes the knees, that's when you start to drive your hips forward using your glutes. So once the bar starts to pass his knees, he picks it up. That's when he drives his hips forward, and at the same time, when that happens, his shoulders start to pull back as his hips push forward like that. But the first initiation is a bit of a pushing the feet into the ground, just like you would kind of like a leg press, and the upper body's really got to stay strong until it gets past the knees, at which point you can push your hips forward. Here it is from the front. We'll watch him do this a couple times. Again, we can see his logo a little bit as he gets sort of set up with it. We'll reset it again. So wiggle his toes, chest proud, takes the slack out, lifts, and goes from there. So does one size fit all in terms of how we want to deadlift? It doesn't. The same kind of rules apply, but you can look at what we call a long arm deadlifter versus a short arm deadlifter, tall guys. This is actually one lift where being tall is advantageous because you don't have to bend down as far. If you have really long arms, especially proportionally, your hips can stay higher, and you just don't have to lift the weight as far. But again, the same rules. Again, that the shoulder blades have to be over top there. The bar is not very far ahead, whether with one guy or the other. Here's a bit more of a biomechanical look. Long torso, short femur. That's a tough one. Whereas someone with a long femur, short torso, they're good at the deadlift, just because of the way they are sort of mechanically. But again, we got to ask why we're doing this. So there are options with a sumo deadlift on the left here. Good for sort of taller lifters. A trap bar deadlift is another great option, especially if you have these higher handles here. It allows you to keep your hips up. You can turn this one into a bit more of a squat, having your shins a bit more angled. Great options, but I always want to make sure that everyone knows how to perform a straight bar deadlift, since that's the most common lift that we're probably going to have. So here's some real live action, I guess, of a shorter athlete and a taller one, and how they kind of go with it. So he's maybe a bit more horizontal than I'd like him to be, but he has to go with his body type. whereas the athlete on the right here is able to kind of get his chest up a little bit better. Both of them could maybe do a bit of a better job of having their chest up before they deadlift, but overall not bad deadlifts. So what are some sort of common mistakes and how not to deadlift? We got to try to minimize the risks and some common deadlifting mistakes. So again, if we're smart about it, we get all the rewards of deadlifting without any risks. So bar drift is kind of one where whenever we set the weight down after a good deadlift, the bar starts to get away from us. You can see how it starts to kind of take him forward as the weight starts to lower the ground. Now that's all right, but it depends if he tries to deadlift it from that spot again. So because when the bar gets away from you and you try to lift it from further away from your feet, so it's not on top of your shoelaces, it's more down towards your toes, that's when we can get into a lot of trouble. So I like to think of doing, if you're going to do a set of 5, for example, you got to think of it as doing 5 sets of 1 rather than 1 set of 5. So you would sort of reset and reload in between each deadlift. So if the bar drifted in front of you, you can just kind of pull it back into that perfect starting position. It's not a lift like most where you can just do rep after rep. Sometimes I really like to make sure, especially when you're starting, that you reset on each deadlift. Because again, this really just increases the risk. Because again, in this perfect scenario here, follow the cursor, I'm going straight up and down. But if you bar drifted, that bar would not be here, it would be a couple inches out in front of you, and whenever you have that weight get out in front of you and you try to lift, that just puts a tremendous amount of strain on the low back. So this is kind of a must that we must make sure that we don't do. Next one is where I'm going to see kind of where the hips really kind of come up before the shoulders. Again, if we're staying strong through our upper back, he's pushing his feet in the ground, but he's not staying strong enough in his upper back to make sure everything comes up at once. As again, we look on over here, again, a lot less weight, but this guy could lift more than in this demo video. But this is what it should look like, is where he's pulling the weight up, his hips and shoulders stay kind of at that good angle and that similar angle as he's going up, whereas this athlete on the left, you can see for sure that his hips come up first. So again, the cue is just a really strong grip, strong back, so that when you push your feet in the ground, your back is holding on to that. So any little change where you push your feet in the ground, the bar starts to lift sort of immediately. Again, the cue of this one is kind of, you got to think of yourself as like literally a human crane lifting that weight. You don't see a crane give when it starts to lift the weight. Everything moves as sort of one unit. Another one is really looking up. You can see this athlete really kind of lifting his head up. We talked about that with the alignment. In this picture, the one on the left has that nice straight line that broomstick or dowel or baseball bat could touch his head, his shoulder blades, and his tailbone, whereas this athlete is really kind of, or same picture, same guy, but really looking up. So this is where we cue a double chin. A lot of athletes just have been coached to look forward their whole lives when they do an exercise, so that head automatically goes up, but it's not a good thing for us. So again, you got to look at this picture with the line across it. That's what your head should look like as you're deadlifting. So the cue we do there is a double chin. Just cue them to double chin. That'll get them to flex the muscles on the inside of their neck and get into the proper position. The last one we're going to cue is what I call sort of a bad mistake, when we call it grip it and rip it. We can see this athlete hasn't done the thing where we talk about taking the slack out. He has his elbows bent and he tries to really lift it and literally tries to rip the bar off the ground. But you can't rip it off the ground. The term deadlift means that the weight is at a completely dead standstill, so we can't get it going really fast right away. And the telltale sign of it is look for elbows. We just don't want those arms bent and then trying to like extend violently. That's a bad thing. And this really leads to back rounding, and this is a very extreme case of that. And again, you can't accelerate the bar. So this is an example of a power clean, which is a deadlift and then popped up to his shoulders. And now obviously you have to go fast when you do that, but if you watch the first deadlift part, there's a significant change in terms of the velocity, where this guy doing the power clean isn't thinking of trying to rip the bar off the ground. He waits until the bar gets just above his knees right now, and then pops his hip forward, and that's when he gets it going. So you got to think of like almost changing gears as you're going to do it if you're going to do that. But with the normal deadlift, it's like using a truck in a very low gear where you can really pull a lot of weight, but you're not going to go very fast, so you can't get going. So this is what happens when you take the slack out. And some real life examples and sort of some cues that you can use. I like to use one where there's what happens if you try to take your truck, for example, and try to pull something. In this case, this guy's trying to tear a tree down. I don't know what he was thinking, but if he would have had a better chance of had he gotten the line tighter and then started to drive, and at least he wouldn't have messed his truck up. Or another example I use here, we live close to a lake, is with water skiing. where we need to have a nice tight line on the rope before the guy in the boat starts to pull off. And if he doesn't, if there's some slack in the rope and the guy in the boat just takes off, what happens is we can't handle that force and we go face first into the water. So in conclusion, this is the deadlift. Again, very short tutorial on deadlifting. Again, we're only scratching the surface with what this is. The deadlift is it's a sport in of itself. There's a lot of stuff to know, and it takes a long time to master, but it's a great exercise because it adds size and it adds strength. That's a great thing if you're a baseball player. If you want to try to hit harder, throw harder, you need extra size and you need extra strength to make that happen. So it's a great exercise to put into your program. And again, it just improves on-field performance, which is what we're doing it for. Again, we need to wiggle the toes, put a wrinkle in our shirt, and take the slack out. Those are the 3 things you need to think about before you lift. And again, always kind of go with that double overhand grip is kind of my personal policy with it. And slow and steady, that applies to not only how we're going to be lifting the weight, like we talked, we don't want to try to accelerate the bar right off the ground, but it also applies to sort of how you might want to progress it in terms of the weight. So deadlifts are usually kind of a lower rep kind of thing. So in this case, I did, for example, I need to be able to do 275 pounds at a deadlift for 5 where I own the weight. And if I were to see a video of you doing the 275 pound deadlift by 5, you need to be able to show it to me, and I need to be able to say, okay, that athlete owns the weight, and then you can go up roughly maybe 10 pounds a side, 5 pounds a side, whatever it is, but then go back down to two reps and then work your way back up to 5. That's and again, slow and steady. Time is on your side. You don't have to try to make huge jumps in weight right off the bat, especially if, again, your goal is, like this line says here, your on-field performance. So hopefully you found that informative. Again, my name is Graham Lehman. I run a site called bigleagueathlete.com. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'd love to hear from you.